Okay. What's going on, you guys? Welcome to another episode of the Dear World Podcast. This is season 5, episode 8, and this is Bro Talk. Today I have with me, go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name's Mike Sanford, and I am I'm many things, but well, for one, I'm your friend and brother. But no, I'm a mental health influencer, advocate, and then also I do a lot of case management work, social services, things like that.
Awesome. And do you want to talk more about what you do, or do you just want to dive into the episode?
We could dive right into the episode. I'm excited for this topic, so we could just dive right in.
Awesome. So I don't think I ever explained what Bro Talk is to the audience. But basically it's just an opportunity not only to get a perspective from other people, but also to hear from men, because oftentimes when I do have guests, it's pretty much just women. So that's why I started
Okay.
this segment, Bro Talk, just so we can hear from guys and what they think and to cover different topics.
Okay. Okay.
So today we're going to be and not only how it affects men, but how it affects Black men. So, the first question I have for you is define trauma in your own words.
Trauma, I guess not to be so textbook, but it's really the idea that an event happens, and based off that event, whatever it is, the way it impacts the person and then their response, I guess, in layman's terms. So, it's really this idea that something can happen to you in your life, and depending on how it impacts you, will dictate how you respond to it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so that I kind of, even when I'm working with clients, like that's kind of like the guiding definition that I use, that something happened and it impacts you in a way that it elicits a response. And so that's kind of how I define trauma.
Is that how you would define it for yourself, though, if trauma affected you, or is that just how you would explain it to other people?
I mean, essentially, that's just a walking definition. That's how I'd explain it to other people. It's just this idea that, and for an example, I'll just use an example. If I'm cutting a knife or using a knife to cut something, and then I cut myself. The holding a knife in and of itself is not traumatic, but the fact that this event, I cut myself, happened, it will, elicit a response. So now moving forward, I'm gonna be cautious. You know what I mean? If I'm in this situation again, and I know it's kind of a dumb example, but that's the way I would define it for all people, that you have an event, and depending on how that event impacts you will dictate your response, and that's your that's trauma by definition.
Got it. So, as a Black man, how do you process trauma? Or if you want to be, like I always say, if the goal of the podcast is to be relatable, transparent, and honest. So, if you wanted to talk about a traumatic event in your life and then how you processed it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, first off, being Black in this country is just a traumatic experience in general. But I mean, just to hit more close to home for me, I always go back to the loss of my mother when I was 15. When I was 15, I was very close to my mom and my parents, still married, two-parent home, that type of thing. Her death was sudden. It was literally out of the blue. Like, we didn't prepare for it. It wasn't like she was sick for so many weeks leading up to, you know what I mean, an untimely death. It was sudden. We went to school that morning, living our life per usual, the way we always did. And then by the time I got out of school and I, walked to my grandparents' house, I learned that she was gone, that she passed. And so to me, that was a traumatic event, you know what I mean? Because wasn't, well, for one, I mean, it's death, it's loss. But for me, it was something that was completely off my grid, something that I wasn't prepared for. And so for me, I I don't even know if it's really fair, but I compare a lot of a lot of stuff in my life to that. And then just the way I cope, like I went through so many different phases of grief and loss, and it was just a very difficult time, just being young and being in that kind of transitional stage anyway. But
Mm-hmm.
then you put on that thick layer of, you lose your mom. And so I think what's interesting is at the time I didn't know how to cope. I didn't have any strategies to cope. And so I found myself really, I guess, acting out of character as a teenager. And now we look back and it would be like, oh, well, that's just, that's what teenagers do. But for me, it was so out of character, some of the stuff that I was doing. And so that was my, I guess, I don't know if that like directly leads into what you were asking, but for me, the way I coped with it was a complete neglect self. Like I neglected, anything that like the idea of self-care, any of that, like that wasn't important. I completely neglected myself because of this traumatic event.
Do you think that's because you were trying to like step away from the experience and maybe like, okay, if I'm not being myself, then I don't have to face the reality that my mom is gone?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it was this idea that like my family, we kind of, I don't even know how to say it. Like we kind of had like the a very safe setup. Like how some people either they come from a single parent home or they come from, what I mean, something like super exciting. Like my parents, like my mom was a teacher and my dad was an EMT. And so for me, life was pretty consistent. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor. We
Okay.
weren't like they were middle aged. Like my parents were in their 40s when we were, that like that age. So it wasn't like, they were like the cool parents or whatever. So I say that just to give context as far as like for us, it wasn't this idea of trying to, or our life wasn't so, outside of the norm. So for me, it was, I don't know if it was necessarily trying to maintain like what you were saying or just the reality that I knew like I lost control. Does that make sense? Like I felt like everything that was constant in my life had completely like gone. So I felt like that was my way of kind of regaining control in some way, if that makes sense.
Hmm. So, quick question. You touched on something when you said you compare like your traumas now or moving forward after your mom passed. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think especially for most black men, the one is this we want to be, and I shouldn't even say black men, but just men in general, but specifically black men. We're problem solvers. Like we try to resolve stuff. We try to, fix it. We try to be fixers, and
And that is
so,
annoying, by the way.
well, like it, but it's. I think it's just it's kind of it's ingrained. It's so like socialized. You get what I'm saying? Like we are conditioned to feel like, yo, if there's a problem, we are present, we can resolve it. And so with that whole trying to be a fixer, I feel like if whatever I'm going through can't compare to that, then I'll like it's kind of my coping strategy. Like, oh, I'll get beyond that. Like it's not that big of a deal. If it's not compared to that, if I can't compare it to that, then I'm good. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. So, do you feel like men and women, and again, specifically speaking about black men and women, do you think we have similar coping mechanisms or do you think we completely process trauma differently? Because I've never actually sat down and done that. Like, oh, if I can get through that major trauma, then I can get through these smaller levels of trauma. I think that's really interesting.
Mhm. You know what? I think there's a couple things. One, men and women do process things differently. And let me just be clear. There are some things that I'm gonna say that are like completely supported by like evidence and science, the whole social work perspective. But then there's some other things that are just my own ideas, thoughts, and perspectives. And so I want to be clear when I answer that because some people may, hear this and be like, that ain't true, or you know what I mean? That is probably my own perspective. But as far as men and women definitely process things differently, right?
Absolutely.
And I think trauma is no exception. When we experience things, for men, that whole fix it, leader, try to be, just address it head on, I guess. Where for women, sometimes, many times, women are more analytical. So it's more of the whole like, let me get through processing this before I even address it, right? And so this whole the way men and women address things, because it's different, it manifests, or the way it's carried out will look different. But I think, to me specifically, Black people, we process stuff completely different than anybody else in the world, just because of our history. And I think about slavery, the way women were forced into situations and roles that were not normal. You get what I'm
Mhm.
saying? Like, they were forced to do things that were outside of the norm, that were definitely outside of the family structure. And so it caused, it's like it pulls on a different set of skills. And so I think a lot of that manifests now, generations and generations later. So, I mean, does that answer the question? Like, as far as, do I think men and women, Black men and women, process stuff differently?
Yeah, but I guess more so maybe the major differences. But I guess that would have to be opinion based on how you maybe process trauma and then compare it to how a woman processes trauma that you know of, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
given the same, like if you use the same scenario of your mom passing away and perhaps you have a female friend whose mom passed away and maybe you guys had a conversation of how you both processed it along those lines.
yeah, I think, but you know what? I think too, like, that's the crazy thing about trauma. It's all about, like, so many things go into play, like the stage of life that you're in. Because even using what you just said, I could use my sister, who is an adult woman now, but she was 9 when it happened, and I was 15. You get what I'm
Right.
saying? And I think that the stage of life was completely different, and then just the type of personality, because she's just a more sensitive, like, spirit. Like, she's just a very, very sensitive person. Where for me, you know what I mean, I can be sensitive about certain things, but I just think when the way we process things is different. And so I think a lot of times the difference between men and women, it really, I guess, depends on the landscape of your life. Like, what does, like, is this a woman that is kind of in a position where she's raising others? Like, I've had friends who, they were the oldest and lost their parents, so they were forced to raise younger siblings. I wasn't necessarily put in that position. You get what I'm saying? So I
Right.
think the landscape of a person's life will dictate how their trauma kind of manifest, or how they respond, what their traumatic response is.
I love that you said that about just the phase of life that you're in, which again prompted me with another question. So, do you feel that like when people are in these various stages of life, as again focusing on Black people, do you think sometimes we steer away from healing from our traumas and using other coping mechanisms? Or do you feel like as time has evolved, we've kind of learned to get more in tune with how to overcome certain things?
Bruh, no. I know, because I have a very strong, like, perspective, orientation around that. It's this, to me, I grew up in a family that I think a lot of, especially during that time, a lot of Black people grew up in. What happens in this house stays in this house, right?
Hmm.
And what I found through working with people is that these secrets that we're forcing, specifically kids, that's usually what we tell little Black kids. What happens in this house stays in this house.
Yep.
And these secrets that we're forcing these young Black children to foster, on top of all of the stuff that society's already telling us, distinguishing what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, we throw this thick layer of stuff that's traumatic for them and then tell them what happens in this house stays in this house. The issue with that is the stuff that happened in this house is affecting me. And so now I'm forced to hold that. And so, and I say that to say, like, when you look at the stages of life, a lot of stuff people have pushed down. And I don't think that, I think we've hit a new page in culture where for Black people, things like therapy is not as taboo as it was. But that's not to say that, culturally we're fully embracing it. You get what I'm saying? And so I think that a lot of people have lived their lives stuffing and packing down, stuff that they were told, don't share this. If you share this, this will, humiliate you, or this will destroy the family, or this will do all this other stuff. And what they didn't realize is that they were constantly teaching young Black kids to wear this mask, and it was wearing on them. And so they grow up to be adults and have families. And if they choose not to break that cycle, they now live their life with that same shame, and they teach their children that.
I agree. And I think that's one thing about like our generation as millennials and then the generation after us. I think we're focused on breaking those generational curses and understanding different things, health, that it's okay to seek professional help, and things of that sort, to get
Mm-hmm.
away from that idea that it has to stay in the family, or keep people out your business, or it's no need to talk to a person that has things going on of their own, they can't solve your problems.
Right.
So I definitely think that has become a thing in helping generations now recover from trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would even venture to say, I think that, I love how you tap into the idea of like the generation, because a lot of people, they just say, like, they think this current generation is millennials, and it's like, no, we the millennials, and we're kind of getting up there.
Yeah.
There's a complete, this generation, I think they call them Z or whatever it is. This
Yeah.
generation after us is completely different. But what I think is so interesting is our generation, the millennials, have, we got to reinvent the wheel, because this mug is broke. Like, this, it's broken for real. And I think this next generation, they have like almost this intolerance for, like, don't give me a broken tool and tell me to fix it for real. You know what I'm
For
saying? And
sure.
I think that those two things working in tandem is what's like steering this. Because again, and I hate to keep like going back to this, but just the time that we're living in as it relates to race relations and how traumatic that is in and of itself. I feel like this generation, even after the millennials, are like, we gotta fix this. And the tools that y'all been handed down obviously have not worked. So, I think that speaks to the tension that every generation that's alive right now is feeling.
I agree. Okay, this question is the last question that I had. I know I steered away from the questions that I originally sent you.
Mm-hmm.
um how do men when they interact with the opposite sex?
So, and it's funny because I was just talking to a friend of mine who you actually are very close to. But anyway, one of the things that I think is so evident is that the trauma that men experience, because we're fixers, we live our life looking through that lens, and we're trying to avoid that at all cost. You get what I'm saying? So, like, let's just say, a man is in a relationship with a woman and gets hurt in a specific way. Every relationship following that is going to be filtered through the lens of, I need to watch out for this type, or I need to watch out for this behavior. And I say that to say, like, a lot of men now, when they interact with women, is really through the lens of their experience. And I get, like, some people are like, well, that's normal. But I think, you cut off a lot of possibility with men specifically, because you won't give them a chance. So I mean, that's just been my observation, that a lot of times, men, we experience when we experience something traumatic, we hold it close to us, and we're walking with it to make sure like we don't experience this again, that it's not duplicated again. And that will even go with like friendships. If a friendship goes sour, when we interact with women, it's through that same lens. You know what I mean? And then even and this is another, I guess, layer, but self-definition. When we go through stuff, we learn stuff about ourselves, right?
Right.
And so if we find out like some good stuff, like, oh, I didn't know I had this type of strength, or I didn't know that I was this resilient or whatever, we kind of wear that and broadcast that as a badge of honor. But then when we go through stuff and it pulls out something like, oh, like a shortcoming or just an ugly aspect of our character, we try to hide that thing, but it manifests again in our interactions and relationships. And so a lot of times women, they trying to figure out this guy, like they're trying to solve this puzzle, but it's not like you're putting together a picture puzzle. This is like moving parts. This thing is evolving, and that's why it makes absolutely no sense. You get what I'm saying? I mean, just being real, it makes no sense. So
I think that's interesting though, because I also think women do that in a sense, but I think it takes us longer to do that. And I think, well, I can speak from personal experience. I've had a relationship that I feel like completely traumatized me. So now when I am talking to a man, it's like, up, you doing what bruh did, so I don't even want to deal with you.
yeah.
So I think it just takes us kind of longer, to catch on to that.
Do you think though that women are more proactive about it than men are? I know you're the one
Who
asking questions, but
No, I think honestly, I think women give out more chances than men do. So I think sometimes we're retroactive, if that makes sense.
mm, that's interesting. Because see, sometimes I think guys, a yeah, it's a lot of moving parts. A lot of stuff plays into this because I think sometimes, like men, we're able to count our losses much quicker. I think so. I agree, but I feel like once we're invested, because it takes a minute for a guy to get invested. So when a man is invested, I honestly believe that it's harder.
But I also will say it goes back to what you said about just what walk, where you are in your walk of life. Because I think someone who is more mature and more experienced, then they will be proactive with the man, like, oh, you are showing me X, Y, and Z signs, so I don't even want to deal with this,
True.
opposed to someone who is younger and less experienced with men and, kind of living in that la-di-da world, like, oh my God, you're so good, I'll give you another chance type of thing. So it definitely plays on your experience, and then also just how you interact with men in general in your recovery, or are you conscious of things, I guess, your triggers, because you have to be able to separate, okay, is this a trigger for me, or is this person really who I'm trying to make them out to be? Because I know sometimes with me it's
Mhm.
literally a trigger. You can do something and it reminds me of that person, when realistically I have to be able to separate you and say, okay, you're your own person, even though you exhibit these characteristics.
See, and I just want to say this because, and I love the fact that you brought up triggers because one of the biggest things that I see working in this field is that people people are not trying to heal from the trauma, they're trying to heal from the trigger. It's just like in
Ooh,
medicine. What you say?
I said, ooh,
Oh,
that was heavy. That was
no,
heavy.
because but I mean think about it. It's just like, let's look at it from a medical perspective. People, when you go to the doctor, a lot of times they give you medicine to address the symptoms and not necessarily or not always address what it is, right? Like when
Mm-hmm.
you go to the drugstore, I guess this is a better example. You go to the drugstore and you got your sinuses are acting up. The medicine that you go and buy, the Mucinex, Sinex, all that stuff, it's just addressing the symptoms that you have, the cough, the runny nose, the tension, the pressure. It very rarely says this medicine will cure your sinuses from getting infected or whatever, you know what I mean,
Right.
is the root cause. And I think a lot of times, you know, when you, and it brought to my mind when you brought up that the word trigger, because times people feel like what happened to me, so I can never address that. So they're like constantly in this fight trying to address their triggers when in reality it's the other way around. What you go through, yes, it won't change, but your trigger is really there to keep you safe. Your trigger is not a bad thing. Learning to cope is what is necessary. But you, like, I feel like people, and what I've seen and also experienced in my, you know, with my own life, but people, what they want to do is remove the trigger or try to, you know, get rid of the trigger when is there to keep you safe. The trigger is your brain's, literally your biology, your brain's makeup to say, yo, this has happened before. You know, here's a warning sign. But I think people we're just so conditioned, like, because we I guess we just want the pain to end, I guess, that we want to address triggers and never address the true trauma.
Mm.
Does
So
that make
I
sense?
it does, but how, I guess, how does one learn to separate, okay, even if it is a trigger, how do we separate that and be able to move forward from it instead of just running every time we're triggered?
Perfect.
Because I guess any situation or relationship or whatever, it can potentially become a trigger of something, but you can't
Right.
literally run every time you're triggered. So how do
Right.
you feel like people can address that?
Excellent question. So the reality is your coping strategies are not to cope with the trauma, it's to cope with the trigger. So implementing coping strategies. So what do I mean? So for instance, say, you know, I'll use your example. You say you were in a relationship that traumatized you, you know, and so now you're triggered by certain things, certain behaviors, certain whatevers. Your coping strategy becomes, you know, I say it like this: we will rather our coping strategy be, you know, ignore the trauma, ignore the pain, act like it didn't happen, and push through. No, a true coping strategy is like, dang, I'm seeing old boy's behavior show up in you, right? So your coping strategy now is to say, what do I know of this person? Right? What do I know if you have, you know, a relationship or you've been with this person a while, what do I know about this person? How can I either A, talk through this with that person, B, talk myself off the ledge, like, you know, just because this looked like this doesn't mean that it's that. Does that make sense?
Hmm. I think that's the hardest part sometimes, though, is, talking yourself off the ledge. But I think that's where self awareness comes into play, and just being able to rationalize things opposed to that fight or flight thing going on.
Well, but again, and this is I once heard a doctor explain this, and it was like, of course, it's going to be way more sophisticated than the way I'm going to explain it, but just going to try to push through this thing. But no, but it was so good because what they were explaining is the makeup of your brain, and like from a spiritual standpoint. So one thing, I didn't say it in the opening, but you know, as a minister, like as a Christian, as a minister, one thing that I always tell people is that, you know, what you don't confront, you'll never conquer, right?
Hmm.
So
Go through it to get through it.
it, there we go. So the truth is that in order to address this stuff, you have to lean into it. So I say that because fight or flight, and this is what the doctor was explaining, flight or flight is not a bad thing. In fact, fight or fight or flight is what allowed our ancestors to survive, as you know, like in the prehistoric age and stuff. They knew that once I leave out of this cave, right, there could potentially be a saber tooth out there. I need to be prepared. I need to be equipped. And you count the cost. Fight or flight literally helps you count the cost of, engaging with this. And a lot of times I think people, their defenses kick in, and they don't process that thing. But fight or flight is not necessarily, it's not a bad thing. It could very well be a good thing. Now the problem becomes, get stuck in that fight or flight mode and live their life in that, because your brain can't even, like, when your mind is releasing cortisol, which is the stress hormone and all that stuff, not to get like super deep in the science of it, but it wears on your brain. It literally, for long periods of time, it wears on it. Like, a little bit helps produce adrenaline. A little bit of it helps you run faster, jump higher, access that strength that you didn't know you had in times that it's necessary. But if you're waking up every morning in that fight or flight mode, it becomes toxic to your brain. It becomes toxic to your mental health and to your organs, and you start gaining weight and all types of stuff. But I say that because it's like, within reason, it's helpful. It's just we get stuck in that place where we're living our life in that mode.
Got it.
She said, "Got it."
Got it. Cause I like when you speak, my brain is like, my wheels are turning. Um, so last question to kind of reel it back into specifically focusing on, like I said,
My bad.
on my brother.
My bad.
Um, no,
I done-
not you. Just to kind of, I want to give like the last piece of advice to any men that might be listening. But how or what are some tips or ways that you think men can go about just dealing with their trauma, processing events, whether past or present?
Well, first, and I'll probably give three, maybe four, but first, and I always start here: seek help. To me, that typically means, getting professional help. So, engaging in therapy. And I know, again, it's kind of taboo, and it's not the sexy thing to say, especially for Black men, because it's, it sometimes can come across as a sign of weakness, which is not necessarily true. But seek help, professional help. Be able to, connect and be able to talk and open up and kind of unpack this stuff, because carrying this by yourself is not helpful. Um, Two, really be honest. I think one of the biggest things is that when we address stuff, because and even within ourselves, and for Black men, even with ourselves, sometimes we camouflage stuff through the filter of our ego, because if I confess that this took a toll on me, or if I confess that I wasn't able to get past this, I'm highlighting a weakness. And so I always say, be honest with yourself. It goes back to that whole, what you don't confront, you can't conquer. So be completely honest about the stuff that impacts you. Um, Two, or three, I guess this is the third thing. The third thing is truly equip yourself with education. I think one of the things is that, a lot of times we are ignorant to the stuff that impacts us, and we are slow to get educated on it. Like, educate yourself about the stuff that impacts you. You know what I'm saying? Like, a good fighter, if they lose the fight, they don't just,
Give up
just
and
be
go home.
mad. Yeah, get right. You know what I'm saying? They like, no, play the footage back. I need to see this. And then in preparation for the match, in preparation for the fight, they're studying their opponent. The
That was
stuff that
a
we
great example, by the way.
Oh, see, I be trying to work on my example. See, I told you I'd be like, but that right there. I mean, it's really the idea that the life we live. It is a fight. We got stuff that we have to, that's trying to take us out, and stuff we have to be victorious over. And so I think it's so important that we study the stuff that impacts us, right? And then two, identify, like, and I think I read this a few years ago, but I saw where it was like, identify the stuff that brings you joy, like the top 10 things that bring you joy, especially for Black men, because it's almost like we don't have time to do this, right? Because it's like right now we fighting the pandemic, we fighting, police brutality. It's like we just trying to be safe out here. But
Right, a lot going on.
right, there's a whole lot going on. But I think identify those things that make you, like 10 things that make you happy, and the first three, zero in on. Like duplicate that in your life all the time. Does that make sense?
It does.
And yeah, so I think that if that stuff is a good starting point, it's a good jumping off point to really addressing our trauma, really addressing experience.
I really like those, especially like educating yourself on the things that are going on with you. And I
Mm-hmm.
think those were really great and specific for men, not only for men, but for everybody, but specifically for men, because I think a lot of times with men, they fight against their emotions, where women sometimes tend to be more in tune, even though I think men control their emotions better than women, but that's a whole nother topic. So
Really? That is another topic, because I think that's a interesting point. But can I say this? And it's not even on that point, but it's something you said as it relates to emotions. And I guess I just want to make sure that I'm expressly clear with the brothers as they're like listening to this. The reality is God gave you your emotions. Your emotions are not a bad thing. We have to be clear. Emotions are meant to be felt and not followed.
say it again for the people in the back.
Our emotions are meant to be felt and not followed. And I think that's where we go wrong. And I mean, again, it is a whole nother conversation talking about who manages emotions better, because anyway, that's neither here nor there. But my point is that a lot of times we experience stuff and we feel a certain way about it. And I mean, we've even gotten to the, like, we have mastered like, this culture has mastered being able to under explain stuff and keep moving, because we're just like, feel a certain type of way. No, you feel a specific way.
Oh, I'm good for saying that.
You
I
right.
feel some type of way.
But no, you don't feel a type of way. You feel a specific way. We just don't want to do the work to address that specific thing, right? It's easier to say, I feel a certain type of way, and keep pushing on. Specifically for fellas, we have to be very clear, because the thing about it is, if we don't want to be emotionally driven, because being emotionally driven will cause us to do things that are not serving us at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
So emotions are not a bad thing. God gave us our emotions. We feel our emotions. If you hurt, you're hurt. If you're upset, you're upset. But we have to be clear about what we're feeling, so that with a clear mind, we can address it and not be driven by our emotions.
I absolutely agree, and I think I needed to hear that one today. So I thank
Well,
you
I'm
for
glad.
that.
I'm glad. I'm here to help. That's really what this is. No, I'm like,
Was there anything else that you wanted to add to the conversation?
I talk a lot, so I'm just going to stop it here, because I don't want your podcast to be 15 hours long. So,
It will
but
cut us off before then.
oh, okay. But no, what I do want to say, not necessarily about the topic, but I want to thank you for your courage to do this podcast. One, thank you for having me on. I've been thirsty to get on, because you popping and everything. So, but
You're welcome anytime. Anytime you can come on.
really, I just appreciate your platform and what you're doing, because it takes courage, because I know that even your tagline, how you want this platform to kind of be established, it requires that of your guests when they're on. But for you, it requires you to be that all the time and kind of live your life in that way. And so I appreciate you having the courage to be that person and to be that voice. And, even though it's in the ninth hour, thinking of the brothers as well. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And I just, I hope that you continue to do it. And, you know, all you got to do is tell me when. Look, I'll make time, because I just enjoy it. So
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate you coming on and again being open about things and just spreading your knowledge and experience.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you for having me.
All right, and we out.
See.